I've got a Batman Beyond head.
I see that. Does that mean you hunted him and successfully?
I got him.
Rich has been the stalker this whole time.
Yeah. Welcome back, everybody. I'm going to look at the webcam for the intro and then completely forget to the entire time. We are here with Rich Fogel. He's a writer on a bunch of your favorite 90s cartoons, but we have him on here specifically for Superman the Animated Series, New Batman Adventures, Batman Beyond, Justice League, even the Zeta Project. Thank you for being here, Rich. We really appreciate you coming on and talking with us today.
It's my pleasure.
Well, to get started, we always ask this question up top. Did you have a favorite superhero when you were a kid?
I really liked the Fantastic Four, also pretty partial to Doctor Strange. What both of those had in common was the adventures in strange, unexplored worlds.
Yeah.
And that creation of an imagined universe that was very exciting to me. I liked the fact that there were these characters who were flawed, vulnerable, but still were brave enough to explore these things.
How did you get into animation writing? What was the journey you took to just break into the industry?
It's kind of funny. I grew up, obviously, being a real comic book nerd, was really into animation. When I was in college, they didn't have a class in animation, and so taught myself animation. After I graduated, Disney had an apprentice animation program. Oddly enough, was being supervised by a man named Donald Duckwall. I did not get into that program. Tim Burton and John Lasseter and Glenn Keane did. So I went a different direction after that, and I went to the American Film Institute, studied cinematography, kicking around Hollywood looking for a job, and I ran into a former roommate of mine, Sam Simon. He went on to co-create The Simpsons. At the time, he was working at a little animation studio out in Reseda called Filmation. And he said, I hear that they're looking for storyboard artists. Okay, I can draw some. Got a job as a storyboard artist at Filmation. Now, you have to realize that this was a very weird time in the animation industry. The people in the industry were either people who had been working in animation for 40 years, getting ready to retire, or they were people who had no experience whatsoever, and they were hiring people off the street. They needed warm bodies, and so they hired me. After doing that for a while, I got really tired of trying to make bad scripts work in storyboard. Being a cocky young guy, I was like, well, I could do that. So I started pitching story ideas, particularly at Hanna-Barbera. The first thing I sold actually was a Smurfs episode. My name was circulating around there. I got called in by Alan Burnett and Jeff Siegel, who were story editing Super Friends. And so that was my first stab at the superhero genre.
It must be interesting storyboarding for Filmation or Hanna-Barbera cartoons because they're all very flat, just shots reused all the time. Did you have to keep that in mind for like Shaggy and Scooby run this way?
It was a factory system, and you had to learn how to tell stories economically within what they could do in their budgets. Yeah. And that was really good training ground. I mean, the Filmation cartoons, for the most part, are not very good, but I would say that it was a great place to start and learn the business because I was able to make a lot of mistakes there and learn as I went along. The first show that I worked on was called Super Stretch and Micro Woman. And then later on, I had a really good time working on the Shazam animated show that they had.
Nice, okay.
And that one was actually a lot of fun because we were able to stick very closely in tone to the original 1940s Captain Marvel. And so that really lent itself to that sort of whimsical style. As a comic book fan, it was both exciting to be working on iconic characters like Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman and stuff like that. But it was also frustrating because they wouldn't let you do any of the things that they would normally do. It was very restrictive. I remember writing one story that had darkseid in it. He had a ship that, not in the dialogue, but just in the block description, I described it as a destroyer. Censors came back with a note that said, you can't call it that. It's too scary. And it's like, well, nobody calls it that in dialogue.
No one actually says it.
We would get crazy notes. At one point, I was given a choice of being on staff for either Super Friends or Smurfs, and I chose Smurfs because we had a lot more leeway in terms of storytelling.
They let you give Papa Smurf the destroyer ship, but the
Gargamel had the destroyer ship.
Yes,
Gargamel.
Gargamel, oh my bad.
We don't know Smurfs.
So jumping into the Superman animated show, you wrote the episode Speed Demons, which introduced the Flash Flash into the DCAU as a whole. There's been debate, I feel like, ever since that episode came out over which version of the Flash it was supposed to be. The voice change and the design change. Some people still hold, oh, maybe the old one was a different Flash. Any intent going into it, or did you just kind of write it as just an amalgamation of Flash? This is just Flash, the secret identity doesn't matter.
I think in my mind, it was always Wally West. The thing is that we wanted him to have that sort of fun, jokey personality that would be a nice contrast to Superman's Boy Scout personality. And so based on my experience from Super Friends, where everybody was just a good guy, in order for these things to work, you had to really hone in on the characters, give them real personalities and things like that. Now, that story was based on stories that had Barry Allen in them. We did sort of fudge the line a little bit there, but in terms of who I thought he was, I always thought he was Wally West.
You also had a hand on bringing the first DCAU Batman and Superman team up in the episode World's Finest. How's the pressure to bring these two iconic characters together for the first time, knowing that it would be so important to bridge these two cartoons together?
It was treated as an event, something that we gave extra special attention to, and it was all hands on deck.
And as a child at the time, I definitely sensed the event when it came out. I was so excited for it.
Same here.
I was lucky enough to be assigned the scene in the bar Batman and Superman meet for the first time, so I got to write that scene.
Flips him over a table,
Yeah, all the way through the part where Clark is back in his apartment and finds that Batman is spying on him. And so I really got chills writing that stuff. It was so much fun. Everybody who worked on these shows had a great love of the source material and of the characters. And so we were as big fans as you were, and we were having fun telling our versions of the stories.
So you're credited for the story on Supergirl's introduction, the Little Girl Lost episode. It was partially adapted into an issue of the Superman Adventures tie-in comic and expanded on by the folks who are credited for writing the script, giving a further look into Supergirl's backstory on Argo, coming forward and bringing in Zod and everything like that. Did you have any hand in the extra story? Was that possibly stuff that came from your original story outlines that they just decided to use elsewhere?
We did have some extra material on that episode just because, again, it was another big event kind of thing. And so we did work a lot out on that. Paul Dini was in on a lot of those discussions. He was friends with the writers of the comic book. And so he spent a lot of time talking with them about stuff. And I think that probably a lot of that material was generated out of their conversations with Paul. I don't think most of it was ever intended to be in the Superman episodes, but it was done in sort of in tandem discussion. As a matter of fact, I think that they were involved at one point in the outline of this, but then production got in the way and I ended up doing more work on it.
We do a lot of timeline related videos on the channel. We started doing this, or at least Maddie started doing this quite a while ago, like 2011, 2012 or something like that. He's researched it so much that we've come across so many different quotes back and forth between different producers about, I purposely put 1992 on a magazine cover or something. And then there's other, Bruce Timms of the world that are of the mind that this is always present day. Batman Beyond is always the future. It doesn't matter what actual year it is. And I can see both sides of it, but we do get occasional stuff like in New Kids in Town where we get a literal 2979 on screen. Like, that's not gonna budge. That's always gonna be the year that episode happens. But the Legion of Superheroes are usually like 1,000 years from whenever now is happening. In your head, is the 2979 so specific because they're going back to Clark Kent as a kid, and is that 1979?
We needed to come up with a number, and yes, I think that was the rationale at the time. However, we didn't feel like that was locking us into saying that current day Superman was in 1992 or whatever it was, because the 2979 was far enough ahead of us. We're not going to need to worry about that for a long time. It left us some flexibility in terms of going back in the past. But in answer to your sort of question, I would say that all of these things were supposed to be set in a sort of unidentified time frame, that Gotham City was the present, but it was also the past and the future at the same time. And the same for Superman's Metropolis. The Batman Beyond world was, 50 years after that, whatever time period that was. And so, you really are making your own timeline. I think it was a good decision. It makes them feel timeless, and it makes it so that somebody can go to HBO Max right now and look at them and not feel like they're watching a dated or old cartoon.
You mentioned HBO Max. They recently had a tweet that said, like, Batman Beyond is in 2029, so you have 8 years to catch up on the things. And every single person that follows us on social media was like, excuse me.
The whole timeline thing's just an interesting thing because, like, when I was trying to get into the DCAU as a whole, I wanted to, knowing that there were all of these tie-in comics, just figure out, like, okay, well, what order do I experience everything in? A lot of people, I think we take it a bit more seriously than we actually do. It's just more or less trying to come up with this is what works, this is what doesn't. It's also given us a lot of, like, ideas of, like, looking at the gaps between things and being like, oh, there's an interesting story that could have happened there that no one ever saw.
It's a fun exercise to think about, like, well, how do these pieces fit together? Reading Marvel comics when I was a kid, they were constantly doing crossovers and having characters appear for a panel or two. Got you thinking that way. A whole world. Go, well, what's going on in the other corners of this? Particularly somebody like Dwayne McDuffie had an encyclopedic mind that he would remember everything he had seen or heard. And he was very good at going back and filling in those spaces. So was Hilary Bader. It's kind of fun where when you're writing a story and you go, I need a character here. Oh yeah, we had that guy who appeared years ago in this. Let's just use him again. And so then it begins to tie it together in a fun way that's rewarding for the audience that is paying attention.
Well, Aquaman's kind of one of those characters. Good segue. A Fish Story.
Congratulate yourself, Ted.
Yes, good segue. A Fish Story was an episode that brought him into the Superman They Made series. A lot more gruff than his appearances and stuff like Super Friends, so he wouldn't be seen as a joke. And that also sort of went on to inform his appearance in the Justice League cartoon. What sort of work went into building that character to make sure that he didn't come across as silly?
The short answer to that is that, again, sort of using the Marvel analogy, we just made him Namor. At the time, DC was playing Aquaman a little bit more along those directions. We just sort of went with that interpretation of his character. In the Superman series, we gave him the classic Aquaman look, but layered this sort of, more serious personality on. And then by the time we got to Justice League, since we were going to be really spending time down in Atlantis, we needed to sort of build the world in terms of like what the aesthetic of the costumes and the characters and stuff like that. Bruce was saying, he's like Ghul the Conqueror, that's what he wanted him to look like. And then we had the discussion about the hook hand, which was, again, what was going on in the comics. And Bruce was very much, the hook hand is stupid. We're not doing the hook hand. The hook hand is dumb. And I was sitting there listening to him going, yeah, you're right. It's dumb. It makes no sense. Unless we can cut it off during the episode and have it have a really good reason for him to do that. And Bruce sat up like this and he was like, we can do that? And I was like, yeah, I don't see why not. I've been pushing this story that I saw as sort of like a Shakespearean tragedy, Macbeth kind of form, and the sun and all of that. And so we tried to really build it into the story so that it had some impact and some meaning. And that sort of goes to the core of what we tried to do in all of the stories. We would try and scrape off all the barnacles from the comic book and sort of get back to the core of what those characters were originally inspired to be and say, okay, who is Aquaman? And then tell the best version of Aquaman that we could.
You brought Ra's al Ghul back for another Batman-Superman crossover in The Demon Reborn. Was there any pressure to make it as epic and exciting as World's Finest? Was it another one of those event-type episodes?
I don't recall that this was ever considered to be an event kind of thing in the way that World's Finest was. By the time we got into the back end of the Superman series, we were more routinely doing team-up kinds of episodes. So we did the one with Aquaman, we did the one with Green Lantern. Doing another one with Batman was making it feel like it was part of the world that Superman was living in. I mean, that being said, Ra's al Ghul is a major villain, and so you always want to do justice by him. We tried to tell a really compelling story that would challenge both Superman and Batman, and Ra's is a villain who is capable of doing that.
One of my favorite episodes of Superman was Legacy, which was the series finale. Part of that episode involved a sort of almost behind the scenes romance between Superman and Lashina of the female Furies on Apokolips. We've heard rumors that there might have been a plot point considered for the Batman Beyond series that would have introduced an illegitimate child between Superman and Lashina that had grown up on Apokolips and now is maybe the new ruler. I wanted to ask if there's any validity to that rumor, if that was ever sort of in mind or in the cards.
To be honest, I don't recall that ever being discussed in the room at the time. The staging of the scene in Legacy clearly suggests that they were sleeping together, but whether or not anything came from that, we never really pursued that. It's possible that somebody had thought about it or something like that, but it never really went anywhere.
Did you ever have any story ideas for another season of Superman that never made it in, or were you pretty satisfied with the conclusion being Legacy?
Legacy had a sort of tortured ride in terms of getting to the screen. It was supposed to be much earlier in the season originally, and Paul Dini was supposed to write it. He was busy with other things and it was not happening, so I was brought in to sort of shepherd it through, and by the time we actually got it through production, it ended up being one of the last ones. I think that we sort of looked at that as a blessing in disguise because it gave us a whole new situation for Superman to be in, and should we have been picked up for another season, we could have told different kinds of stories. The first Superman story that I wrote was the Brainiac story, Stolen Memories. Talking with Alan at the time, and there were scenes where Superman is talking to the generals about this ship that's coming down and everything like that, and I questioned it at the time. I said, wait, Superman is sort of newly arrived in Metropolis and they're just suddenly, they trust him? That seems a little weird to me. They were like, no, this is just the way we're playing it, because they were trying to build a contrast to the Batman character, that Superman was really different. He was not the dark hero, he was the light hero. We played Superman that way. He was everybody's friend, nobody questioned him and everything like that. Later on, introducing that element gave us a doorway to tell some different kinds of stories, but we just never got a chance to do it.
New Batman adventures. So you were responsible for reintroducing the audience to this world's Bat family through the episode Sins of the Father. What kind of pressure was there to make sure you got it right and lived up to the legacy of the original run of the Batman animated series?
Personally, I felt a lot of pressure. I was under contract other places, and so I was not available to work on the original series, and it just killed me because I love Batman. I loved what they were doing with it, and I have a really good working relationship with Alan, so it was sort of like, oh, darn, I missed the opportunity. When they announced that Batman was coming back and I realized I was going to have an opportunity to write Batman in this version, I was thrilled, really a dream come true. And so I put a lot of pressure on myself. There was a big learning curve in terms of how far we could push the action, punching and guns and things like that. They kept telling me to go farther. I still had sort of a little bit of my Super Friends blinders on, and I had to sort of like peel those away and go for it. We had the overall idea of that this season was going to be the Bat family, that we were going to have a new Robin. It was important to have an origin that made sense, was not just copying what was in the comic books, but that worked within our world. The origin that we gave to this Robin ties in a little bit closer to like the Jason Todd one. Tim Drake was the current Robin. We gave him that name. And so again, he became an amalgam of what we felt were the best versions that we could work with. And we liked his sort of more playful personality as well.
Was there ever talk about potentially Jason Todd having existed between the two shows? Because I know when we come back to the new Batman adventures, we've got the new Robin costume that's sitting there, and it's kind of in like a Jason Todd-esque memorial thing. So
I don't recall ever having that discussion. I don't know.
Whatever you tell us is the official answer forever. So you
kind of simultaneously to the series being brought back to life, we were reintroduced to the world in the tie-in comics Batman Adventures: The Lost Years. Since, this is tied to episodes that you worked on, I guess we were kind of curious if you had any hand in talking with the comics creators there, or if that was just another Paul Dini go-around, or what was going on in that situation.
Those were written by Hilary Bader, and she was on staff at the time. So those comics are more closely aligned because she had an insider view of what was going on in production. I don't know if you know anything about Hilary. She was a very talented and interesting woman, had a background in children's theater back east. Then she got breast cancer, survived that, and that sort of flipped a switch in her head. Well, I may not have much time left, so I'm going to make the most of it. And she had always been a fan of Star Trek and things like that, so she wrote a Next Generation, I think it was, script, submitted it blind, and they liked it, and they bought it. And so she got on a motorcycle and drove across country and moved out to Hollywood it to become a screenwriter. And she had great success, and she was hired on Star Trek, and then she was hired on as a Superman writer. A wonderful font of ideas. Oh, you could do this, or you could do this, or you could do this. There were times when, after we would be talking for an hour, I would just send her out of the room so that I could sort of process what all we had been talking about. And she was a very fast writer, and so she had some extra time on her hands, and so she took on writing some of the comic books things. She wrote The Lost Years. She also wrote a bunch of the Batman Beyond comic books. I do remember having some conversations with her about like filling in the blanks of things here, but again, it was a more casual thing. We weren't really worrying that much about what's canon and what's not. We were just trying to work out what makes sense in the world that we're creating.
There's been a lot of talk about the Creeper episode. They never found the right episode to bring him in until the new Batman Adventures. What was it that finally made this version of the yellow-skinned wacky man work?
I was a huge fan of the Creeper. I thought he was like one of the weirdest heroes that DC had, a fun contrast to work him into the Batman show. And Alan was up for it as well. And it was a tough nut to crack. We started actually very early in the season talking about the Creeper show, and it took almost until the end to the point where we were happy with it. I do think he ended up being a lot of fun. He has that sort of combination of things where he's got a lot of the pathos of a Batman villain, but he's not a villain. He's an interesting character from that standpoint.
And the Creeper was featured in a lot of the early promotional materials for the new Batman Adventures too. So we were curious if there were maybe any other plans to like keep him with the Batman family should it have been renewed for another season perhaps.
Our initial idea was that he was going to be part of this world and a sort of new element in it, but because it took us so long to get the story worked out, we just sort of ran out of time. So I certainly think we would have loved to have brought him back. We were talking about stories that we didn't get to tell. There was one episode that I did want to talk about briefly, which is the Firefly episode. First of all, the episode didn't come out quite the way that I had hoped it would. With Cassidy, I wanted her to be a genuine talent. At the time, Bruce was driving in the car and heard some Britney Spears song on the radio, and it just annoyed the hell out of him. And so he decided to make her a really bad singer.
My cheeks are hot, my lips are burning, the flames of love dance in my eyes.
For me, that threw the whole motivation of the show off. You wonder why this guy is so obsessed
Why he
with
cares,
this.
yeah.
Whereas if she had really been a true diva belting out this song, you could see her star power, then you could understand his obsession with her. You clearly see that she was traumatized by the effects of the episode. And so the story that I was hoping to tell later on was that she would become the next Firefly, that she was so traumatized by this thing that she became obsessed with fire and ultimately tried to become the thing that she was afraid of.
Well, we have a fan webcomic that we make, and Ted, you're going to totally put that in it now? You talked about the Britney Spears thing, reminded me of in the Secret Society episode. You totally did that again with Shauna Squires, never singing anything.
And then you got that line from the question about the prepackaged bubblegum corporate crap. Sounds like Bruce wasn't a big fan of pop music.
Yeah, I guess so.
I guess now we're moving into Batman Beyond.